Okay, there we go. So, welcome everybody. Today's verse is verse 21 of chapter 2. So, the verse goes, Veda vinashinam nityam ya ena majamavyayam katham sa purusha partha kam yati hantikam. So, the core meaning of this verse is, remember, this is being said by Krishna, and he's saying, O Partha, which is another name for Arjun, how can a person who knows the soul to be indestructible, eternal, unborn, and immutable kill anyone or cause anybody to get killed? So, this verse is almost like Krishna is asking a rhetorical question. So, he's not introducing a whole new teaching, but he's asking, if everything I have told you just now is true, then what follows after all of that? So, think of the flow of the Gita so far that we have learned. 2:12, verse 12, he says that the self always exists. Remember, the self means soul. Always keep that in mind. That's really important. 2:13, he says that the self passes through bodily change. 2:14, sorry, not 2:14, 2:16, he says that the real never ceases to be. 2:17, he says that the self is indestructible. 2:18, he says that bodies perish, but the soul does not. 2:19, he says that the soul neither kills nor is killed. And 2:20, which is the verse before the verse that we're doing today, he says that the soul is unborn, the soul is eternal, and the soul is untouched by the 6 stages of material existence. Take note that this is all about our soul and how it is, how it's perceived, and how it's never ceased to exist, how it's always existed, how it's eternal, and all of that. It's basically just describing the soul and telling us what is inside of it. And now comes verse 21. If someone truly understands all of this teaching that Krishna has put out, how could they think in terms of absolute killing and absolute destruction? So Krishna is connecting knowledge and perception, because knowledge is not always information. Knowledge is supposed to change how you see reality for yourselves. So this verse specifically, it begins with knowledge, saying Veda, meaning he knows. Now this is important because Krishna does not say he has heard, he has memorized, he has read. He says he knows. In Sanskrit philosophy, knowing means something much deeper than just memorization. It means knowledge has become pure realization for them. Knowledge has entered your way of seeing how you see the world, how you see the material world, how you see the transcendental world. For example, a child may fear their shadow because they think it's a whole nother person who is stalking them and creeping up to them or something. That shadow did not change, but guess what did change? Their perception of the shadow. Similarly, here Krishna says, when somebody truly knows the nature of the soul, their perception of life and their perception of death also changes. So the 4 descriptions of the self, they appear once again. Indestructible, which means the self cannot be destroyed. Nityam, which means eternal. Ajam, which means unborn. And Avyayam, which means immutable. So, indestructible, I'm sure we already know what that means. Indestructible means that it cannot be destroyed. Eternal means that it exists in all time periods. Adam, or unborn, means that it was never created, it's always just existed. And Avyayam, or immutable, that means that it never diminishes or that it never deteriorates. So notice something really beautiful here. Krishna is repeating himself. We've heard this before. We've heard this in a previous verse. But why exactly is he repeating himself? To understand something, to understand something specifically spiritual, it often requires repetition and repeating things multiple times. Think about, this is probably my least favorite subject, think about math. You don't understand a difficult math concept after just hearing it one time. The teacher has to explain it again and again and again from like whole different angles for it to finally click in your brain. If it takes that much for just regular knowledge for the world, or like regular knowledge that we've learned at school to click in our head, then imagine how much repetition it takes for this spiritual knowledge to finally click into our head and change the way that we see the world. So Krishna here, he's doing exactly that. Each verse adds another piece to the remaining puzzle. Each repetition, that removes another layer of misunderstanding that we have. So here in this verse, the great question, Gatam sa purusha, meaning how can such a person? This is almost Krishna's way of saying it simply would not make sense that way. So if you know that the soul cannot be destroyed, how can you believe that ultimate destruction is happening, that ultimate destruction is taking place? If you know that the self is unborn, how could you think that the self's existence is suddenly going to end? If you know that the self never undergoes the 6 material transformations, how could you confuse bodily death with annihilation? So the conclusion of that is going to naturally follow. But wait, we all know people clearly die. We've probably seen it before. We've been to like funerals or stuff like that. This is where people often pause. Bodies die, funerals happen, people grieve, but is the soul really dead? What does Krishna mean here? Krishna is asking us to distinguish between two perspectives. Relative perspective, meaning bodies are born, and then bodies die. Actions have consequences, grief exists. And then there's the ultimate perspective. The self remains untouched. The existence continues. Identity at its deepest level is not destroyed. Krishna is teaching Arjuna to see both viewpoints. He's not denying the relative world, he's not denying the ultimate world, but he's just telling Arjuna to look at both sides, and he's preventing Arjuna from mistaking those two. If we're going to look at Sankaracharya's insight, let's see what he has to say. According to Sankaracharya, this verse reinforces the truth that the self is neither the doer nor the object of destruction. So, this is basically saying that the self is unborn, the self is eternal, the self is actionless, and the self is immutable. So, action, it belongs in the body-mind complex. Therefore, when somebody decides or when somebody realizes their true identity as the soul, they no longer superimpose bodily activeness onto consciousness. For Sankaracharya, Krishna's question is almost logical. How can somebody who knows that the self is indestructible still think in terms of absolute killing? And such thinking, I've said this before, it only arises from ignorance. Okay, that's important. Remember that. Ramanujacharya, on the other hand, he emphasizes another important point here. The knowledge of the soul's eternity does not eliminate moral responsibility. Just because the soul is eternal doesn't mean that your actions don't have consequences. It only removes the fear that bodily death equals like pure annihilation or something. The individual self, it remains real, it remains eternal, and thus Arjuna should not abandon his duty because of a mistaken understanding of death. Knowledge is meant to bring clarity, not indifference, not carelessness, not ignorance, but clarity. And this distinction is really important because Krishna is not teaching that nothing matters. He's teaching he's teaching Arjun to understand correctly what is actually happening instead of being ignorant and just assuming. So, close your eyes and go ahead and imagine a child watching a butterfly emerge from a cocoon. You guys know what that is, right? A cocoon is where caterpillars go in for like a few months until they go through the transformation of becoming a butterfly. The child cries, "The butterfly died." But an adult says, "No, look, the butterfly has not ceased to exist. It has just moved into another form of expression." But they understand it differently. So here Krishna is trying to be like the adult in the story. He's trying to move Arjun from the child's perspective to the adult's perspective. So, if I was to summarize this verse, I would say that this verse, it connects knowledge with action by asking a profound question. If a person truly knows that the soul is indestructible, then why do they think of absolute killing in terms of like ultimate reality or like pure destruction? Krishna here, he's not denying that bodily death exists, because obviously we've seen funerals, we know people die, but the soul doesn't, and that's exactly what he's trying to teach here. Sankaracharya, he interprets this verse as affirming that the self is actionless and that the self is beyond both doership and destruction. Ramanujacharya, he agrees that the soul's eternity removes fear of annihilation, while also emphasizing that knowledge should lead to what? Clarity. Knowledge should lead to clarity in performing one's duty. So together, these teachings, what I taught, what Ramanujacharya thinks, and what Sankaracharya thinks, all three of these teachings, they show that genuine spiritual realization changes one's perspective of this entire reality that we're living in. And it allows a person to act without being overwhelmed by misconceptions. I'm so sorry, I cannot talk today. These teachings, they allow and they show genuine spiritual realization, and it allows somebody to act without being overwhelmed by misconceptions about the nature of the self. Thank you.